very thankful to have up here on the stage with us Melinda with CAR, who will be moderating our policy, looking at a range of different state policy issues, and I'll turn it over to Melinda to introduce our panelists.
Thank you. I've told our panelists that they need to up their game after the last panel, so good luck, everyone. The panel that we have here today, they have a very prestigious set of resumes, so I'm just going to hit some high points very quickly. We have, next to me, we have former Senate President Paige Cortez, who is a state legislator in the House and the Senate from 2008 until 2024. Next to him, we have House Speaker Philip deVilliers, who has been in the House since 2016. Next to Philip, we have former House Speaker Pro Tem Walt Leger, who is currently the President and CEO of New Orleans and Company, which is New Orleans' tourism and marketing organization. And he was in the House for 12 years, from 2008 through 2020. And then we have Paul Rainwater, who is a jack of all trades in terms of disaster response and recovery. He's a disaster response consultant currently. He works at Cornerstone Government Affairs. He had more titles in Governor Bobby Jindal's administration than I can probably count, including Chief of Staff. He was the former Executive Director of the Louisiana Recovery Authority, and the list goes on and on and on. I'm going to start off with, the first question is, since this is both about Katrina and Rita, I'd like each one of you to tell us where you were and sort of what your first memories of Katrina and or Rita are, and I'll start with Senator Cortez.
Well, I'm going to go quick because I want to get to the interesting stuff at the end when we actually go back and forth from banner. So I was born and raised in Lafayette, and so I remember very clearly, of course, I remember Andrew coming through and really giving us a beating, but then the Rita, Katrina, Gustav, Ike, we were sort of the place that it all avoided. It just kept coming towards us and going east and west. And so, my memories are family moving in here from the New Orleans area and having to go into schools here and we're taking care of it. And then I also remember the Cajun Dome and all of that very clearly, but mostly probably thankful that we avoided the disaster. Anyway, that's my memories of it. Mr. Speaker wasn't born yet, but he'll tell you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I've never been to an MMA fight, but sitting in here and watching the last panel, it makes me really excited and kind of interested in going to one. But on a serious note, I'll tell you what you were able to see up here was something that we see day in and day out in the legislative process. It's really about passion, it's about care, it's about being a voice of our constituency. So, sometimes y'all don't get to see all of the inside disagreements, but that's just a small, I think, light on what we see in the legislative process. And certainly I've served with both of the gentlemen to my left and my right. We didn't always agree on things, but we certainly respected each other throughout the process. So I want to thank the last panel for their passion and for their willingness to continue to fight for their constituency. So my name is Philip deVilliers. I am the current Speaker of the Louisiana House of Representatives. So for Katrina and Rita, I think is the question, as a contractor during that time, I went literally from Texas to Mississippi, all up and down the coast. And I think that's some of the images that took place that I've seen still actually affect me today, quite honestly. I can remember seeing homes and businesses literally on the middle of the highway. I remember seeing animals in trees and on high lines. I can remember going and having an appointment with people who needed assistance with moving their homes back to where they were, whether they were in a pasture 100 yards away or just fell off their foundation in their own yard. And when you showed up, you met droves of people who no longer knew where their homes, where their belongings, where generational things that had been given to them were anymore. And I can also remember going into New Orleans, and there was things that had floated that were once on the table that had ended up on the fans. And I can remember looking at the rooftops, and you can see where people literally cut holes in the roofs to get out. So at the time I was just a contractor. I certainly wasn't in the legislature, but I certainly traveled through roads, many roads throughout the coastal regions from Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And I can tell you it was an extremely difficult time. It was a time that reality set in, and I really learned what was important in life during that time. So thank you for putting this together, and I look forward to learning as we go forward.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here today at University of Louisiana and Lafayette at the Blanco Institute for this. So thank you for the invitation, Stephen, and team here at UL. I'm Walt Leger. I am President and CEO of New Orleans and Company. We happen to have an MMA fight in New Orleans just a couple of days ago. It's a huge success because of a lot of our friends from Lafayette who came over and visited us. So it was spectacular to have you there, and I'm excited to be here. In 2005, August 29th, I was an assistant district attorney in New Orleans at the time. And about 9 months prior to Katrina, I bought my first home in my hometown of Araby, Louisiana, about 2 miles from the place where the levees would break, just a couple of months later. And I bought this little shotgun on Royal Street, which I tell people affectionately was 69 blocks off of Canal. It was in the 6900 block of Royal Street in Araby, and as you can imagine, that did not work out so well. Fortunately, I was in Baton Rouge when Katrina struck, staying with my sister who was a student at LSU, and like so many, I recall my father and I that night, as people were celebrating that we had dodged a bullet, understanding that our home of St. Bernard Parish had not dodged that bullet and was in fact already devastated, with every building in the parish destroyed, every school, every hospital, every home, every business, everything destroyed, only for that to get worse when the levees broke just a few hours later. And so my home looked very much like the homes of the lower Ninth Ward, with the same waters. When I finally got home, I had a chair from my dining room table that was jammed into the ceiling, and my little 1,600 square foot shotgun house had been knocked off of its cinder block foundation. And so 15 feet of water, but also the force of that water knocking the building off of its foundation was a little stunning. And there really isn't any time that goes by where I don't think about the things that I lost. But they weren't the real physical things. They were the memories, they were the pictures, they were the letters that my parents had written to me in high school when I went on my senior retreat and things like that, things that are truly irreplaceable. So you learn a lot about what matters and what doesn't, and it's truly not the things, it's the things that are irreplaceable and that connect you to a memory. I also had the benefit, though, of getting with some of my colleagues in the DA's office and coming in pretty quickly to the city because the district attorney's office had been destroyed. And so we came in with a U-Haul to get the files out of the office, and were met by National Guardsmen from all over the country who had come in to help. They helped us to get into the building, to get the files out, and then ultimately open up a temporary district attorney's office where we were working 24-hour shifts at the train station with a locomotive engine providing the only power that could be utilized. Earl Kane came down from Angola, opened up a temporary facility, and we were processing people in and out at that point. The thing that I'll remember the most is we were working 24-hour shifts at the train station. We'd have an investigator drive us into town from Baton Rouge, drop us off, and then he would come back and pick us up 24 hours later. A colleague of mine and I opened up that office. We broke into the travel agency office at the train station and made that the district attorney's office. And then, and I'll recall that night when it finally got dark, that there wasn't a single light operating in the city of New Orleans within the whole perimeter of the city, except that one light operated by a locomotive engine at the train station, something that I don't think I'll ever forget as long as I live.
Thank you, Walt, for that. And thank you, Melinda, and thank you, Steve, for inviting me. Sitting here, listening to my good friends Garret Graves and Gordy Dove debate about what should and shouldn't be, every right to do that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience. And I was the city manager in Lake Charles, Louisiana during Katrina. I had done 2 deployments. I deployed right after September 11th to Afghanistan as part of the Army's early entry module. I deployed again in 2004 to stand up support units in Iraq, Afghanistan, earned a combat action badge. When I got back, I wasn't a city manager anymore. I was a soldier. As Katrina was approaching, and I'd been an emergency manager in Calcasieu back in the 90s and had some friends there. As Katrina was approaching New Orleans on the 27th, Governor Blanco called in Mayor Randy Roach and said, hey, Paul's got some experience. We think we might need him, but we're not sure. But I'm calling up 4 folks. We don't want a lot of folks around here, but he's got experience, we want good people. So I felt honored to do it. On August 29th, as the storm had passed through, I was manning the logistics desk, and someone from the Corps of Engineers came on to the floor and said, we've had a levee breach. And we've had another levee breach, and another levee breach. By the next day, I was asked to go and help a gentleman named Major Ralph Mitchell, who was a state trooper, district commander in Terrebonne Parish, man the I-10 causeway side. For those 3 days, until Jerome came in with a little management team, with dead bodies laying around the site, with children who had been lost. I'll never forget this, as long as there are 2 images that stick in my mind besides the bodies. A little girl that I found in the crowd who had lost her mother and father. And I picked up that little girl and I held her for about 4 hours until Children and Family Services could get there. I don't know what happened to her. And I'll never really know because there were no records, there was nothing. And not anybody's fault. Katrina was such an impactful disaster. The second thing I remember is a gentleman standing in line, African-American gentleman who had a suitcase. He was about to get on one of the buses that we had finally got, there was probably a bus an hour thereabouts, but I'll never forget this as long as I live because it helped me understand the dignity of life. This gentleman straightened up his tie before he got on the bus to leave. And I just never forget those 2 things. So we were there for 3 days. General Honoré rolled in, and I was released to go back to the state. And then Lake Charles, Louisiana was collecting up a lot of Katrina evacuees. Being the city manager, I went back, and then we all know what happens. We have Hurricane Rita happen, so we have to evacuate the evacuees. I worked with the Louisiana Recovery Authority that first 6 months with Governor Blanco and Andy Copeland, went to D.C. as Mary Lange's legislative director for 1 full year, and then came back and had 4 different jobs with Governor Jindal. But the entire time, I had 2 things. I was the fiduciary agent over all FEMA public assistance, and the fiduciary agent over all community development block grant money. End of story. Now, it didn't mean that I was a big-headed guy running around, but I worked with Garret. I worked with cities and municipalities. I remember very well meeting with parish presidents and city thousands of meetings about what it is we need to do, where do we need to go. So with that said, I'm very proud to be here. I think this has been a phenomenal discussion. This is how we figure out the right and wrong answers, by debating them. Is it always nice and pretty? No, it's not, but it's the right thing to do. Thank you.
So that dovetails nicely into my first question for y'all, which is obviously Katrina and Rita forced conversations about disaster response, but it created conversations about planning and the appropriate roles of different agencies, and it was like at that point nothing was off the table. There were no weird ideas or strange things. So in that vein, what government changes in the aftermath of those storms do you think are sort of the best things to come out of the aftermath of Katrina and Rita? And are there any places where you think we need additional change? And I'll start with Senator Cortez.
Well, the 2 things that, I know when Walt and I got to the House of Representatives, we were in sort of the post-recovery. Now it was funding issues and trying to fix policy for the future. And obviously the building codes were huge. We were amending them because they had already put them in place. But you had created geographic political fights. The North Louisiana members were like, we don't need to build our houses a different way. It cost us more money. You do, South Louisiana. And then the South Louisiana guys were saying, you're in the same pool of insurance as us, and we're going to fix ours To do what? To try to reduce insurance rates. So we don't want your roof flying off just because you don't want to do it, you don't want to spend the extra money. Then we had the CPRA that was, created, and by the way, it was so interesting to me. I served as 4 years as chairman of the Transportation Committee in the Senate, which has to approve the annual plan, and I got to do that 4 years in a row. I had a master plan, and I'm thinking, man, I didn't know all this stuff. I mean, I read that master plan. I think I authored the resolution to approve it, and then we had a very entertaining but educational meeting. Then the other thing that CPRA created, again, a North Louisiana versus South Louisiana, because when we got one-time money, surplus money, was where do you put it? And of course, it was always deferred maintenance. I was going to get a little piece here, and then I was going to get a little piece there. Infrastructure, we were always screaming for roads, and of course, North Louisiana wanted to finish I-49 North, and the coast was like, no, we need money for the coast. And so those debates, I think, created political, geographic fights that I think have, continued, but I think they were really good policies. And then, of course, the speaker was here when we did the fortified roof program, and that was just a sort of an add-on to the building codes that came later. But those policies, I think, were important, and I think they were positive, and they will prove to be as we go on.
Speaker DeVilliers, same question. Are there specific government reforms that you think are applaudable after Katrina, and are more reforms needed?
Yeah, as mentioned earlier, I was not in the legislature immediately after those storms, but I could remember working directly with FEMA, and everyone here knows FEMA, right? But I think through the process, I was involved with OCD, or Office of Community Development. I think the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness was created somewhat during that time as well. And then the parishes also created a lot of their own Office of Emergency Preparedness. So we saw a lot of these things created after those major events, and it helped us to really communicate better on how can we prepare and how can we do things better in Louisiana to try to be prepared for the next storm. And certainly, as mentioned by Senator President Cortez, the Fortified Roof Program is probably the single, if not the most important thing that we can do to try to help when it comes to homeowners' policies. So, when we meet with the insurance commissioner and you ask, hey, what is it that we can do to help Louisiana's homeowner policy become more affordable, the single thing that they can actually point to is the Fortified Roof Program. So we have certainly funded those things through the years. We would like to fund it better, but as you have a certain amount of contractors that can do the roof work and things of that nature, and so many constituents that would actually apply for the grants. There's something that we are certainly building upon, so that's one of the biggest things that we can do moving forward right now. When it comes to FEMA, that's a whole different conversation, I think, for a little bit later.
Next panel. So Walt, obviously, particularly in your area, you saw the consolidation of the levee boards, you saw a complete overhaul in education. Are there specific things that you would point to that if there is any silver lining of Katrina, that was it?
I think that in 2008, when I got to the legislature, there was already bubbling up from the city, certainly a sense of hope and I think resilience, and what could we do to build a stronger city, a stronger Louisiana. There were certainly vigorous debates about how to do that, but there was a sense of collaboration in the legislature when Paige and I got there about how we were going to rebuild the state together, and he spoke a little bit to the rivalries and the geographic challenges that emerged, but at the beginning of it, there was a lot of progress. And certainly, the last panel spoke to professionalizing levee districts and flood district authorities across the state. I think a lot of that was achieved, but what you also learn in working on public policy is that no reform is ever really done. There's always some tweaking that needs to be done to it. There's often somebody on the other side of it who tries to undo it as time goes on, and Paul spoke to sort of the sustainability of some of the major education reforms that happened there. And I do want to call out my former chairman in education, Don Trahan, former state representative over there, whose committee that I sat on for a number of years and went through a lot of these debates. And of course, I see Julie Stokes and also Vince Pierre. But so many people that were both trying to reform things, but maybe unreform things over those years. And I think that maybe more importantly, the lessons learned are to try to really zero in on those things that can bring us together and figure out how you forge a path forward on it. I think CPRA really is something that stands out as a major achievement for the state. And I think one thing that resonated with me so strongly was, I was ultimately elected to the legislature in New Orleans, in Orleans Parish, even though I had grown up and lived in St. Bernard Parish for so long. So I felt that I had a very regional approach to the way that I thought about how things needed to happen. I still believe very strongly in the regional approach to addressing these concerns, but it struck me at the time and throughout my service in the legislature how popular coastal restoration and hurricane protection was from a polling standpoint. When you polled people before Hurricane Katrina in the city, and certainly to the north above I-10, you wouldn't have found anybody saying that they supported investing billions of dollars in coastal restoration and hurricane protection, although there were plenty of people working to establish that narrative, and Katrina really flipped the switch on that. And a lot of great people, including the Millings, including Sidney Coffey and so many others with America's Wetlands, were able to really help move the needle. Senator Landrieu, of course, and so many others. I think that's something we need to continue to stay focused on. And these two gentlemen have referenced building codes. One of the lessons, as we look at Katrina Forward, building codes are maybe more important today than they were even then. And when you think about insurance and the issues facing us, fortification, thinking about moving from resiliency into resistance, how you harden assets, how you build things more structurally sound, and how you probably more than anything paint the picture for the insurance industry on the things that the legislature does and that our communities do to be more resistant. That's how we're going to actually achieve what we need to achieve. If the markets don't recognize what you're doing and act accordingly, then you've only gone halfway. And so I think we've both got to do those things, but also paint that picture for the marketplace to be able to respond to it.
Paul, obviously Louisiana has now spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on hardening its infrastructure, things like the communication network, setting up, sheltering opportunities, and just thinking of disaster response more holistically. From your perspective, has enough been done? What are the highlights, and where do you see more work needed?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, right? And look, I'm not a scientist, so I don't really talk about climate change that much, but I know something's happening in the climate. I mean, I'm working in Hawaii and in New Mexico on historic fires, right now. So if you look at what we spent money on 10 years ago, for example, $250 million of community development block grant money to Entergy, right? It was the first time it had ever been done in the history of the country, right? So it was a piece of federal legislation, and the state's focus on how important Entergy and energy infrastructure is to the state of Louisiana from an economic perspective, end of story, right? And then you look at some of the buildings that we rebuilt. Paul talked about the schools in New Orleans, which are built to a different standard now, that can withstand elevations are super important. All of those different things. Our challenge is that the same infrastructure that I helped get money for in 2005 and 6 is the same infrastructure I was hired to help redo after Hurricanes Laura and Ida, and spent almost 2 years working in DC on helping rebuild the same infrastructure. So I don't know how we solve for that, right? And hardening in the future where we're at, I mean, obviously, we should have our underground utilities. That's expensive. We live, our population in Louisiana has a little bit of a challenge paying for that. We've got, ratepayer systems, public service commission. There are a lot of different complexities. There is money, resiliency money, that allows us to do some of that, but there's not enough money to go around around the country. So we have to make kind of strategic decisions about what's important, what's not. But then that gets into who we are as a people. I mean, Louisianians, I mean, democracy is a very important thing. So you got to try to figure out how to balance some of that out. And I've probably spent from the last 12 years, probably 400 public meetings around the country, including the 200 I did here in Louisiana about how we were going to rebuild. And so these are not, as we know, just discussing the mid-Barrett area, these are not easy conversations to have. And it's not going to get any easier because there is something going on in our climate. It is getting harsher, whatever the cause is. That's not for me to debate. It's for somebody else to debate. My job is typically trying to figure out what are the solutions to help people survive.
Obviously, one of the conversations that's happening nationally as the impacts of climate change hit across various states is what is the role of government in response? So I'd like to ask you each to talk about what you see as the role of the state government, the legislative branch, sort of where do you think the government has a place to respond to these things? And I'll start with Senator Cortez.
So I, was Senate President during Laura and Delta, and, I was on the Blackhawks, flying over the coast and was able to do all that. When Gustav and I I was a member of the House Appropriations Committee with Bob Leger and didn't get to see any of that. We weren't in, quote, leadership at the time. But as you all know, when a declaration, a federal declaration, emergency declaration happens, or a state declaration, or a local declaration, it basically pulls all the power and puts it in the executive branch so that they can suspend laws without asking the legislative branch. They can do a lot of things, and they don't have to even talk to you about it. It's very frustrating. When COVID hit, we all know the backlash during the COVID emergency declaration. But the interesting part is, what do you want? How many people can cook a gumbo? You can't have 40 people saying this is the next thing we want to do. And of course, when we were in the House, there's 105 House members. And if you're in the bottom 50, all you can do is throw grenades at the guys in the top 50 because the other one's making the decision or trying to. And poor Speaker's got 104 others he's got to babysit and tell him he's doing exactly what they asked him to do. In the Senate, it's a little easier. We have 39. And, so as you get to work with the executive branch, and Governor John Bell Edwards was good about bringing us in and saying, here's the problem at hand at State Police Headquarters, but we don't know what to do yet. We're going to wait for everything to come in, and then you turn to the locals. As Paul stated earlier, they all have their emergency declaration. They're all doing their own thing, and how do you coordinate? Well, you can't have 144 legislators involved in that. But when that finishes, the first thing they want to do is say, now we got to pass funding bills. And then they now have to come to you and say, you control the purse strings, here's our priority, can you help me with this? Well, if you haven't communicated, it's hard to get that support. And that's where the disconnect, I think, occurs. And it's not like anybody's fault. Everybody said, where were you when it hit? You were busy trying to survive. And you don't have time to pick up the phone and call 144 legislators at the governor and say, look, I want to keep you in the loop on what's going on. You do have staff that's trying to do a little bit of that. But I think the role of government is you've got to turn it over to the executives. Let them go do their job. They were elected to do that. But when the time comes, not when the emergency declaration ends, but when the time to talk is there, you have to be, I think Walt said it, you have to look at a comprehensive approach and be able to work with each other, whether you're a different party or a different region, and try to solve the problems.
Speaker DeVellier, similar question for you. What do you see as the role of government? Obviously, after Katrina and Rita, the government ran housing programs, we ran education programs, we ran, communications programs, we ran all kinds of things. So what do you see as the role of government as we see more and more disasters in the state?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Just looking around the audience, and I see Jean-Paul Cousson's here as well. You didn't get to mention his name, but I had the opportunity to work with so many different members in the legislature over the last 10 years. But a little bit further beyond that, I've been able to go throughout Louisiana multiple times in 105 different districts throughout the state and really sit down and listen to the members' constituency. And throughout these tours, going from Shreveport down to Plaquemines Parish, there is a difference in needs. So that's something that we have to appreciate and understand, especially when we're in leadership. But I'll tell you, going through the coast and going through the coastal regions, you'll see areas where they'll put up RAP, which is essentially large rocks, to try to slow down waves or storm action. You'll see other areas where they put up levees, and some of these levees were actually built by the parish themselves without any FEMA assistance. And I'll tell you, in the last 10 years, just going down to Grand Isle, every year we had a legislative fishing rodeo. And I was telling my wife just Friday when we were going over LA1, I'm looking at Mary Senator Lander, LA1, which thank you for getting that for Louisiana. It's a beautiful road that they're still constructing today. But you're looking around going south, and I told my wife, I said, I can remember just 10 years ago fishing in these areas where they had structure. And today that structure is no longer there, it's just water. So certainly there's things that are changing, and those things are changing rapidly. But I'm going to go back to the diversion discussion, and not to get into any kind of heated conversation, but in leadership, when this was going on in the legislature most recently, I brought in 6 different members that this diversion would directly affect their constituency. And I said, respectively, I'd like to ask each one of you in the room at the same time, how do you feel about the project? And 2 of the 6 were very much in favor. I would say 2 of the 6 were adamantly against, and 2 of the 6 were kind of indifferent. The reason I'm sharing all of that with you, I think the role of government is really to understand how the decisions that we make in Baton Rouge, and quite honestly in DC, affect our constituency across the entire state of Louisiana, and really across the entire country. Because if you understand where Fouchon is, and I may or may not be saying it right, but Port Fouchon is one of the largest ports in the country, which is very much accountable for the energy across the entire United States. So even if you may never go and travel down LA1, you might ask yourself, why in the world are they putting billions of dollars in infrastructure for a few people to drive their fishing boats south? That's not always the case. So I think the role of government is to listen and be the voice of our constituencies. And I know Monique is out here as well. She was in charge of one of the, I'm going to say it wrong, but what was the drainage area? The watershed initiatives. And we probably got a little sideways on that at a meeting or 2, but I never really understood going throughout the different parishes in the watershed, if we were going to, let's just say, dig a canal or dredge in Lafayette Parish, but we're not going to do anything maybe further south in Vermilion, what's going to happen to those individuals when we bring water through one area faster and flood a place further south? So to me, whenever you go through these watershed initiatives and you get around the area and you understand how it affects each individual constituency, maybe if you go to the furthest north and do a retention area to hold the water, and then you go a little bit further and you do some, let's just say, some dredging. You go a little bit further and you do some, I guess you call it picking, when you go in and you pull the branches and the things that are in the canal out of the way, and then you install, they put in these monitoring wells, which that was something I was adamantly against until recently, when you saw the floods happening in Texas. And you imagine if they would have had these wells in place, these monitoring wells in place, to have a notification for people to understand, hey, now is the time that you need to get out of the way. So I've done a very poor job of listening, I would say, over the last 8 years. But now that I've had the position, I would say, of being the speaker.
To tell him that, too.
Yes, absolutely. Both of these gentlemen. Guys,
We raised him well. We raised him well.
But I'll be, that's kind of.
I was going to say, I think the speaker just did a very articulate job of describing exactly what leadership is, which is trying to see the big picture and apply it in a broad way that isn't just focused on your constituency, but on the broader. So I commend you for that. I think That's accurate. I was gonna say, I think the role of the legislature in an emergency is to just stay out of the way. And that was always my approach. That wasn't always some of my
How's that
colleagues'
been
approach.
going for them?
Yeah, not well, I don't think. It never went well. Look, as a leader, you do feel like you need to be in that EOC and know what's going on and be able to communicate back. And fortunately, we had, leadership representing us in those rooms and ensuring that they were communicating out to us. But ultimately, I always felt very odd during a hurricane when I was in the legislature, because I very much wanted to know what was going on so I could help my local officials, but I also very much felt compelled to stay out of the way and not be a burden to people like Paul Rainwater, who were in the room making things happen. And I want to commend him. Part of what made that possible for me probably was people like Paul Rainwater, and in fact, Paul himself. Having leaders that you can trust, that have been through it and know what they're doing and are communicative, is really critical in a disaster. And unfortunately, in Louisiana, we go through these very, very regularly. So what I want to add to the conversation in response to this question is, the real role of the legislature is to be thoughtful in response after the fact and try to be prepared. And something that I think has come up repeatedly through the panels is you never have enough money or resources, and we never will. That's why we all meet every year as a legislature and carve up the money and try to apply it in the best way that you can, because the resources are limited. And I'll say that the thing that I think we need to be incredibly cautious about as we continue to move forward is being thoughtful about how we do that. I learned over my time there, especially being on appropriations for 12 years, that what legislators do is they spend every penny that they get every year, no matter how much it is. And that's not Democrat, Republican, or anything else. It's why towards the end of my career, I worked on the Revenue Stabilization Fund. That's now got about $3 billion in it. I know there's a lot of conversations around what should happen with that moving forward. I think we should be extremely cautious about not having it available in an environment where we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen next. And when we've talked about not having resources, that is a source of resources that we've been able to establish that is there for us if we need it in a very significant way, because we've also talked about the fact that $3 billion doesn't go as far as it used to. And 3 years from now, $3 billion won't go as far as $3 billion goes today. So it sounds like a lot of money to have in reserve. I think ultimately in the climate that we find ourselves in, as unpredictable as it is, and one in which we know that we will probably face a crisis of some kind every 5 years, whether we like it or not, I think being prepared and having revenue available to be able to respond is something that is as critical as it's ever been, and I think will only continue to be critical as we move forward.
Paul, I'm going to switch it up for you a little bit because I'm cognizant of the time. You've had different roles, obviously, across government. One was obviously disaster response and focusing on getting dollars to communities in need, but you also were commissioner of administration at some point, so you had to balance the needs of North and South Louisiana. As Senator Cortez mentioned, that's obviously always a tension. So how did you think through your approach to disaster recovery versus the needs of the entire state?
So I appreciate that question, and I had like you said, I kind of had a dual role for 7 years right there. My nickname was, and I don't think very many people know this, but internally in the staff they called me Colonel Commissioner. Right? It sounded like a Russian term, but that's because I was a fiduciary agent over FEMA, public assistance, community development block grant money, and from deputy chief of staff all the way to chief of staff, commissioner, I worked on the budget. And we all know very well that my good friends, Dr. Savoy and Kim Hunter-Reed know about, and Paul Pastrack and others who work in state government, including Mr. Graves and others, and legislators, we had some budget challenges. And so, but what I learned, and I see Senator Mary Landry over there, we would talk a lot on the phone about, like, what is the balance, right? Because there were moments, and I will admit it to this group, since it's probably, the statute of limitations are well up now. I did use community development block grant money in healthcare in an area that was hit by disaster. City of New Orleans is a perfect example in their healthcare system. They had a $30 million hole. I worked with 4 different HUD secretaries, 4 different Homeland Security secretaries, 4 different vice presidents, literally briefing, and one of the best was he was Senator Joe Biden, and Vice President Joe Biden in the Obama administration, was anointed to be the czar over recovery in the White House. So he would come here, and he would sit, and he would say, now, Paul, is this pass the red face test? Or we would go up there. But what we did is we balanced all those challenges out and figured out how to politely use disaster money in the right way, but in a way that also helped the community recover. Because I had worked too hard with Senator Landrieu and the entire congressional delegation. I know you hear from Congressman Bustamante, who was an amazing champion for Louisiana, and I had an honor to serve with all those folks. So there was, to me, right, there's the fiduciary responsibility of how we got that money and what the country expected us to do with that money. And then the needs of the state, like the immediate needs. And there were opportunities, thankfully, after lots of prayer, where you were able to fit and meet both of those goals. Now, that didn't make it easy, for me with my good friend Representative Leger or Representative Paige Cortez or Senator Cortez or others, because they have a responsibility to provide oversight for you. That's their job. And my job is to answer that the best I can, honestly, as best I can. Take out the talking points, because it's always, I don't care who you are in politics, no offense to the mayor president, but we have a natural, it is our innate in us to protect our bosses, to protect the institution we work for. It's just built in, but it's their job to challenge the executive branch for the best answer, and if so, penetrate through there to find the right answer. I always hope I gave the right answer, but anyway.
You usually do.
So Paul brought up what I think everybody in this room will remember, which is the budgetary whiplash post-Katrina Rita. First, the state had to cut hundreds of millions of dollars out of the budget in a special session that Governor Blanco called at the time. And then all of a sudden, all of that recovery money sort of inflated the coffers of the state. And some decisions were made to cut taxes and do various financial maneuvers that higher education campuses will recall as some of the worst times for them in terms of the cuts that then happened. So I'd like to start with Speaker de Villiers. You came in after all of the melee, and I'm wondering what lessons did you take away from watching what happened post-Katrina Rita in terms of the state's budget?
Yeah, I can tell you, I can remember looking at the history of our state budget, and I was extremely forward to see that as our budget would grow, our expenses were growing, our reoccurring expenses were growing with one-time budget inflation. And, I wasn't a part of that, but I can tell you, you run for office, and I was running all these conservative principles, and then getting elected in 2015, you walk in and they say, hey, congratulations, and by the way, you have $1 billion mid-year deficit. That was eye-opening. But I think what the leadership did at the time and what we are still seeing today, it makes really good sense is when you have one-time money coming in, you use those on one-time expenses and try to not grow reoccurring expenses. And I mean, look, we don't have to get into the debate over the teacher pay raise, but the teacher pay is a $200 million reoccurring expense. And we knew over the last several years that, the 1.6 sales tax and then of course the 0.45 was supposed to be temporary. All those things were going to be going away. And then you were like, well, how are we going to continue to pay for a reoccurring expense? So we were trying to do those things more recently in a manner that as I would say our economy stabilizes, then we can do things to maybe pay things consistently that are reoccurring. So, I mean, we have, and under certain of these guys' leadership that's up here, taken the monies that we've gotten from the federal government, or whether it's from COVID or from hurricane disasters or whatever it might be, and use those as a one-time revenue coming in, so a one-time expense going out. And we've done a lot of that on infrastructure and things of that nature.
Senator Cortez, I won't ask you if you regret voting to reverse the Stelly plan, but what I will ask you is, when you saw sort of the financial up and downs that came post storms, are there long-term decisions that you made as Senate President that were impacted by the years after Katrina and Rita.
Absolutely, and I think, speaking to you, just hit on it, which is normalcy comes back. And when normalcy comes back, after the, I'm going to call it the boom cycle. So what happens is you have a disaster. Federal dollars come into your economy. There's a bunch of blue tarps on roofs. Guess what? The local hardware store is selling you the shingles and the lumber to fix it, and there's a carpenter that's going to buy that, and they're making more. If they have a corporation, their corporate income tax goes up, their personal income tax goes up, the sales tax goes up. We're just driving this monster straight up with revenues, and so, and I used to think, and I still sort of think the Senate's always right, but the Senate was the author to the repeal of the Stelly Act. I want you to know that when we were in the House. So we didn't have much choice when it got to us. We had to vote for it. So the reduction in Stelly, which is interesting, it was only half of Stelly. It didn't reverse the whole thing. It said, we're going to reduce the income tax, which is a good thing, but we didn't put the sales tax back in place and all those things that had been taken off of sales tax. So we took the hit. And then, I'm going to add one more thing. So we cut taxes, and at the same time, we spent a surplus. And then within the next year, we're facing this huge deficit. And how do you deal with the deficit? Well, right the next year comes the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act from the feds. And I remember Dr. Sawa being in appropriations when I said, well, this is not state general fund you're putting in the higher ed budget. It's $200 million of ARA funds. What do we do in 2 years when ARA goes away? And they couldn't answer. And then the governor general at the time came to the table. I think he's calling right now. He came to the table and I said, and I probably regret it now, I said, you're going to destroy higher education. Did I get anything after that?
You were right.
But I didn't get any capital outlay after that. Thank God Mike Michaud was the Senate Finance Chairman at the time. That's the only way I could get anything. But the point was, we made some decisions based on these federal dollars coming in, and we kept creating a bigger operating budget. What I learned was, when I became a member of REC, is always take the most conservative approach, the lowest amount of revenue we think we're going to get, because anything extra is one-time money that we'll spend on one-time expenses. I think that's the greatest thing that came out of it, because during those early Jindal years, I mean, look, Jim Tucker was the speaker, Joel Chasson was the Senate president, but they were being pushed to take the highest number because there was no money. And then if they came into one-time money, we were selling off assets to fund the operating budget. So we went from that to the complete opposite in my last 8 years in the legislature, where we took the lowest, most conservative, and we always had these surpluses. And so we started to cut sales tax. So we went to the 0.45. And then, lo and behold, we leave office and they have to deal with that. And so it's just nature. It's just a 50% vote to 50+1 vote to reduce the tax. It takes a 2/3 to put it back on. So it's a difficult thing. But the lesson I think we learned was in REC.
Walt, I've been told we have 5 minutes left.
Yeah,
so-
well, I mean, timing's everything. I mentioned I bought a house about 6 months before Katrina that got totally destroyed. Well, I got to the legislature just in time for us to have record deficits, only to work through that for 12 years and then leave when they got all the record surpluses that they could spend. So timing is everything, But grateful for the experience in a way, right? I will never forget, though, you mentioned the Stelly vote. I won't ever forget then Lieutenant Governor Mitch Landrieu calling me and imploring me to vote against that bill that came out of the Senate, got to the House, and was a runaway train because of the surpluses we had. We were going to cut everybody's taxes and be heroes, right? That didn't work out so well. But fortunately, we did battle our way through and get to where we are now, which is with relative stability, and I think some great fiscal restraint over the last decade that's led us to some stability. I hope that we'll maintain that. I think that's important. You mentioned, federal dollars that become available for you. What I still lament from that time frame was, while we were taking some federal dollars and plugging them in operationally to some parts of the budget, we turned down record amounts of money that were one-time infrastructure expenditures, things like rail between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, $450 million, things like rural broadband, I think $85 million that we've eventually got maybe 10 years later, but we would have had it 10 years earlier. So, there are some great infrastructure dollars from the federal government that we need to make sure we take and use for one-time purposes. Caution on how you expand the operational expenditures, I think, is wise, but I hope that we'll continue to find ways to maximize what we get. We've talked a lot about the working coast. We've talked a lot about the things that we do for this nation. We've talked a lot about the Mississippi River and the fact that it built the land that we're standing on, but it continues to power this whole country and to move product all over the world, and to be one of the most highly efficient and operating ports anywhere on the planet. And so we need to continue to find the ways to get infrastructure dollars to invest in that and expand it so that we can deal with some of the other issues that our state faces, have a more diversified economy, and do the things that I think we all want to do, which is invest in education for the future of our kids. So I do think we're in a good place though fiscally, and I think these two gentlemen to my left have been, not often to my left, but today to my left, have done a great job of keeping us on the straight and narrow, and that's just going to keep getting harder. The truth is, when you do have resources that keep coming your way and you have stability, there are temptations that come with that. So I'm pulling for them to keep us within the guardrails.
Can I get the last word? That's awesome.
Yes, sir.
Well, so I'm gonna
1
switch,
minute.
I'm gonna switch it up on you, Paul, because you and I talked about something that I do want to hit on before we wrap it up, so this will be, you get to have the final word. You and I talked about 20 years is a long time, but it seems as though there is not everybody remembers quite the scale and the massive nature of the devastation of Katrina. That enough time has passed. If you live in other parts of the state, it is not prominent in your mind. And so on that note, I'm wondering if you still feel the sense of urgency, if you think this state is ready for the next storm, because inevitably we're going to have one, and if you think we have done enough to prepare to appropriately respond.
That's a good question. Just real quick, I have a lot of respect for these gentlemen on the budget, and I did get hired by Higher Ed under the John L. Edwards administration to fix some of the problems that we created in the general administration. I just wanted to make that clear.
Are you seeking out solution?
I actually received it from a couple of folks, but nonetheless, are we prepared? So Governor Jeff Landry and his team, and look, a lot of the people that are currently in the Office of Homeland Security are people that worked for me in what was called the Civil Military Operation. And they are, General Musaf, for example, was a lieutenant colonel who worked for me. Fudge are people who understand what response means. The agencies, and it's something that, that we learned hard, and again, these storms just keep getting more aggressive, right? And so the agencies continue to run drills and work with local government, just as we did during Gustav Isaac and on. We have done a really good job, I believe, of drilling down, and again, that's part of it. Look, there is, pre-Katrina, there was not a Homeland Security committee, or they had committee oversight. Now you have aggressive committee oversight by the legislature who receives reports monthly. They're involved in what's happening, whether it's about cyber, storms, floods. So yes, I do believe as a state, we still have people who remember Katrina and Rita and still take those lessons seriously and never want to repeat or have that happen to us. Even with the changing Federal Emergency Management Agency, I will tell you that I was very proud. I went to a FEMA review committee with our Homeland Security Director, and he stood up in the meeting and looked at the chairman of that committee and said, "You're going backwards." He said that. You're going backwards. You're going backwards, federal government. We're not in Louisiana. We're going forward. We're going to be ready, but are you going to be there for us when it's time? And there are things that are going to happen that a state cannot manage. In Texas, the floods in Texas, one of the big challenges was a specialty search and rescue team that FEMA provides, that wasn't able to provide because of the bureaucracy. We talk about bureaucracy a lot. Not in Louisiana, it's not going to happen. We make really good decisions, we make strong decisions. Our local leaders, our state leaders are ready to respond, and if they don't, then you have gentlemen like Speaker DeVilliers, the Senate President, who will say, "Hey, what happened here?" So I think that as a state, as holistic, as a unit of government, local, state, legislative, council, I think that we're strong across the board. And I would put us up against anybody in the country as responders and people who have learned lessons and who are compassionate and caring about the people in our state. So.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Please give them a round of applause.
I'd like to respond to Paul, if I could.